I want to go back to what we talked about in the beginning, Michael and David both, and that was the little bit of good news that the administration got. The job situation does appear to be a little better, but it looks like to me we're a long way from getting back to where this economy ought to be, Michael.
Well, there's no question. I think that the president understands that you've got to, in a very serious way, target those most vulnerable populations with an uptick, as one has talked about, in terms of creating jobs. But that's not any kind of jobs. You don't want, you got a dearth of low-skilled, high-wage jobs. That has gone the way of the dodo with the shift from manufacturing to service industries. The service industries are now, in one sense, bloated with people who have jobs in name only, but none of the benefits that come along. That's why healthcare reform was so important, not simply in terms of providing health care to those who formerly were not benefited by that, but also in terms of the employment track that was connected to that health care. And I think that a lot of these populations, when I mentioned earlier, African-American people, if you've got a 16.5% unemployment rate there, or at least a 13-something unemployment rate among Latinos, then you've got populations which are especially vulnerable. Then when you take into account Appalachian, Middle America, it's pretty tough. So I think the president is trying to push forward, and his Council of Economic Advisors are trying to talk about what can be done to spread the wealth, so to speak. But I don't think we can avoid a kind of redistribution wealth of upward in terms of the big corporations that are getting the benefits of the stimulus package versus those states that are more diverse that deserve more of that payoff.
When can we expect to be out of this? Everybody seems to think we've hit bottom, but this is going to be a long road, isn't it?
It is going to be a long road, and it's all a question of how you define the this part. If it's joblessness, the guesswork is that the rate will go down in a small way through the end of the year and maybe end up at 8% at the end of the year. But governments aren't very good at creating jobs. And the pressure is certainly going to build on President Obama to focus on deficits and debt. And that is also going to be a big element of his own re-election campaign. So keeping up these kinds of spending levels, where the United States government is spending about 11% of GDP, is not a sustainable path. And yet what we have not yet heard from the Obama administration is what the debt plan is. And I suspect you'll probably have to hear from the president on that by midsummer.
And Democrats know that this is an issue that they're very vulnerable on. I mean, Republicans are hammering away at them and at the president every single day saying, where are the jobs? Where are the jobs? So they're really hoping that in the next few months, in addition to financial regulation, they can also pass a few more small jobs bills like the one that they passed a couple of months ago. But it's very questionable how much these jobs bills actually do. And then, of course, if there's a Supreme Court confirmation process that comes up midsummer, we all know that that really brings everything to a halt. That takes weeks to get through, even if it's not a controversial Supreme Court nomination.
Right, and that's why I think you're not going to see they don't want a big fight. They had a big fight on health care, and look what happened in his approval ratings. But when you talk about where Republicans really have some traction, a big area where they have traction, and this is a huge problem for this administration, is what you're going to do about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the top 4 9/11 suspects, and also what are you going to do about the future of Guantanamo.
So what are they going to, is this on the back burner now?
No. I mean, they are actively working within the White House, in the Justice Department, in the State Department, in the Defense Department for how they're going to prosecute Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, and those 4 top plotters. Remember, the Attorney General with great fanfare said they were going to be tried here in New York City, just a few 100 yards away from Ground Zero, and now they've backtracked on that because of the huge opposition to that.
Well,
so what do they do? That's it. And then voters, the polls show this is an area where they don't want Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to come here. I mean, the voters and the polls are hardening on that.
Well, someone in the White House said to me, I said, do you think in the end you'll wind up trying him in a military tribunal? And this person said yes, in about 2016. But they're not going to bring him to trial right away, are they, Jan?
No, I mean, they're still trying to decide what they're going to do with him and where they're going to hold this trial. You can only have it in the 3 places where the crimes occurred: New York, Pennsylvania, or Virginia. Obviously, New York City, the plane that went down Pennsylvania, and then, of course, at the Pentagon.
You think it'll be a civilian trial or
it could be a civilian trial. That's still on the table. There's a possibility they could do it, say, for example, at the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia. Have a criminal trial on a military base. You've got security concerns would be less in there, but that raises a host of other concerns. So why not just leave it in a military commission? Maybe off the coast of Florida.
Well, I still think it's possible they'll be tried in Guantanamo. I think that's now appearing to be maybe the most likely scenario. But one thing you have to remember, these trials are largely for show, whether they're in the civilian court or the military court, because the administration has already made it clear there is no way, no matter what the verdict is, that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, and some of these other top al-Qaeda co-conspirators are going to walk free. And in the end, it could be that the administration ends up with the same kind of enemy combatant, ill-defined policy that the Bush administration had.
Well, that was part of the problem then, because they wanted to distinguish themselves from the Bush administration by not trying to terrorize the domestic population by saying if you disagree with our policies, all of a sudden you're unpatriotic or anti-American. But at the same time, the difficulty is, of course, trying to convince the rest of the American population that having this kind of domestic trial is best suited for people who are terrorists. But I think the Jihad Jane throws into bold relief, too, this kind of targeted policy. You just don't know where the terrorists show up. And I think the return to American homegrown terror is the real news here. It's not all of a sudden that militia in Michigan are sprouting wings and flying. These are the people who paved the path for al-Qaeda.
I've got to ask one thing here because I want to shift to the Republicans. They didn't have much of a week last week with Michael Steele, the head of the Republican National Committee, getting stuck with a tab in a bondage bar or whatever it was. Republicans seem to have their strategy down. That is opposition. Right. To oppose Obama. But so far they have not coalesced around, and I guess it's a little early for this, any one leader. Nancy, who do you think is going to emerge as the leader of the Republican Party?
Well, that's a great question. I think that that's something that the Republicans are grappling with, and that's why you don't hear a lot of them clamoring for Michael Steele to step down or to be replaced, because it's just not clear to them who they would replace him with. One Democratic spokesperson said to me this week, any day that I can mention lesbian bondage club and Republicans in the same sentence is a great week for me. And the challenge for Republicans is that they are trying to create an image right now as a rehabilitated party that is the party of financial responsibility. And then when you've got the RNC spending money hand over fist for things like this, it's really complicated.
But let's talk about candidates. I mean, Mitt Romney, is he a leading candidate, David? Is it going to wind up Sarah Palin? I do not believe it will be, but some do, I think.
I think it would be hard for it to wind up being Sarah Palin, just given the fact that so far she has not come out with much of an agenda of her own. Mitt Romney...
Making a lot of money.
Is making a lot of money.
Raising a lot, I should say.
And a reality show with the booth. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. But Mitt Romney comes from a core Republican constituency that may well have worked in the last presidential campaign, had it gone on for a bit longer. Obviously, it didn't work out for him. The question is he too middle of the road for where the party feels it's got to be in the next election?
Well, what do you think, Jan?
Well, I think that, as Nancy says, there's no one. I mean, that's kind of the problem. When you're looking at who's going to be, who is the next Republican presidential nominee going to be? It's this wide open field. And when you look back at Romney and the Palentis, that feels like we've been there and done that. People looking for something new. Maybe it would be, not that a newly elected senator who'd only been in the Senate for a couple years could ever be elected president. We do have one in Massachusetts.
I tell you one thing, I think it is not out of the question that he might well be on the ticket. And of course, we're talking about Scott Brown.
I think their best bet is at the midterm elections. I think when it comes to trying to trump Obama in the next election, it's looking pretty good for the Democrats right now, because if you put Sarah Palin, they're praying for Palin to come forward, and if the Republicans as a default candidate would have her, I think Scott Brown might be more surprising than people might anticipate. All right.